and welcome. I have a important question to ask you. Ready? Can you remember what color shirt you wore yesterday? Chances are you just did. And if I could look in your eyes, there's a good chance your eyes might have moved up and to the left, which is kind of a not true for all people, but going into visual memory for many people is kind of up and to the left. And as an aside, if I asked you to describe your dream home, chances your eyes would move up and to the right into kind of visual create. But the point I want to offer here is how it's really interesting how when there's a question like that, what color shirt did you wear yesterday? The mind can't not go there. It's a really simple phenomena. But this phenomena of asking questions and noticing where your mind goes, it can change your life. This is a topic I've thought a lot about. I'm fascinated by this. And I'm really looking forward to sharing some practices and some applications that I think could be really helpful for you. I'm really excited to share this with you. And one of the questions I always ask myself before writing one of these talks is, why is this important? To me, the power of questions is a phenomenal way to not only solve real-world problems, but to really explore the nature of reality itself. And there are lots of unexamined questions kind of in the substrate of our consciousness that can be really limiting. And being able to recognize the thoughts that sort of set you up for failure or curtail your success, identifying those can be really, really powerful. So what I would like to cover in this time I have with you is to talk a little bit about the power of a mind that asks questions. I'll give a little bit of background, and I would also like to talk about, in broader terms, how the power of questions, or what we call inquiry, of how inquiry in Western culture has really transformed consciousness through philosophy, through science, through medicine. But also to explore how inquiry in the East has also transformed consciousness by directing awareness toward the nature of self, toward the nature of reality. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about some practical applications about how questions and inquiry can really make a difference in your life. As you may know, if you've listened to my talks over these years, I'm fascinated with what I call pragmatic Dharma. I'm not that interested in philosophy. I'm not all that interested in original texts. A little bit, for sure. I find it fascinating. But I'm really interested in practical applications. So while for this talk I'm going to wander a little bit into philosophy, I really hope that it will be supportive in terms of these direct practices that can really, really make a difference in your life. So as to the power of a questioning mind, one of the stories kind of in my familial lexicon is a moment. I wasn't there. Dinner with my family. I believe grandkids were there, and my niece was demonstrating some reluctance when it came to eating her squash. I don't blame her. I'm not that fond of squash myself. But my father, her grandfather, said, "Don't you want to grow up and be big and strong?" And, dinner went on. But after that, my niece stopped eating yellow food. She was by the way, she wasn't 16. She was like maybe 4 or something like that. So 4-year-old niece, I forgot to preface that. But she wouldn't eat anything yellow. She wouldn't eat squash for sure. But then like bananas and corn and, yellow food. Finally, as they teased this out, she's an incredibly bright little being, that her logic came through. And she said something to the effect of, if I get big and strong, that means I'm growing up. If I grow up, that means I'm getting older and I'll become an adult. If I become an adult, that means I'm going to die. Therefore, if I don't eat yellow vegetables, I won't die. It's pretty solid logic, wouldn't you say? And I'm just so amazed at how the chain of internal events that came out of that one question, don't you want to grow up and be big and strong, leading to no, because if I grow up and get big and strong, I'm going to die. Questions set things in motion. They point and guide the mind in a particular direction, sometimes in really unhelpful ways. Sometimes they guide us towards solutions, and sometimes toward awareness itself. And also, there are unexamined questions that dramatically limit your appreciation and your whole experience of life. For example, I realized at one point when I was kind of in a large community and I was running lots of meetings that I had a question before I walked into every meeting. How can I survive this next meeting? Wow. Did that set me up for unpleasant situations? If you ever thought to yourself, how can I possibly make it to the weekend? Or why do I keep falling short of what I know I could accomplish in my life? When you ask those questions, the mind can't not go there. When I realized how much I had set myself up for misery at every meeting that I was running or showing up to, I realized I had another option. And so I started to ask myself, how could I have fun at this next meeting? That question drew up a huge blank for a long time. And then I realized, because part of inquiry, and we're going to talk about the science of inquiry, is you stay with the question. It's a cathartic question. And it occurred to me, I love telling jokes. I love making people laugh. So to make meetings fun, I had a joke ready for the next meeting. And while I may have pushed some levels of obnoxiousness, I started at least looking forward to the idea of making some people laugh. And some people, not everyone, was sort of like looking forward to like, oh God, what's he going to say this time? Very, very small, minor example, but it definitely changed how I relate to meetings. And I noticed when I wasn't in that grim, how can I survive this next meeting? I was more creative. I was more relational. My entire attitude shifted. I still don't look forward to meetings, but I'm on to myself a little bit more. So let me ask you a question right now. If you'd like, you can close your eyes. I'm going to ask you two questions. This will be just a few moments. Where do you feel the breath the most predominant on the inside right now? Second question. When you sense the breath moving through your nostrils, does one nostril feel more open than the other? If you like, you can deepen your breath. You can open your eyes. You notice the difference between, notice the breath as a command or a directive versus the question, the invitation. There are really kind of two ways we can direct ourselves. One is directive and one is invitational. I prefer invitational. Some people really like directive. And I guess there are times I like directive as well. But the interesting thing is how when I ask you, where do you feel the breath the most predominant on the inside right now? Chances are you began to notice. And what happened when I asked you if one nostril feels more open than the other? You may have noticed that your attention moved there to sort of examine the comparison between the airflow between the right nostril and the left nostril. And chances are very, very good one was a little more constricted than the other. And that's kind of how there's a whole kind of yogic science to that, of how you'll alternate the Ida and the Pingala, the two energy forces that move through the body. There's this movement back and forth, rebalancing the brain. But nonetheless, again, I wander. A very simple rule from yoga philosophy. In Sanskrit, it's prana follows chitta. That is to say, energy follows attention. Energy follows awareness. What you focus on, energy tends to move toward what you focus on. It's one of the most simple teachings and one of the most powerful and one of the most overlooked teachings. Whatever you focus on, energy will move in that direction. What I find so interesting about this is, for example, if you're doing a body scan meditation, like for example, right now, if you like Zen Pop Quiz, you can close your eyes. Notice what happens when you bring your attention to your scalp, to the crown of your head, and just hold your attention there and kind of wait and sense. Now, is it possible that you're feeling more subtle sensations, maybe a little tingling, maybe kind of an amorphous, heightened perception of energy and feeling along the scalp? Energy follows awareness. This is so foundational. So if you like, you can open your eyes once again. Our life is run by questions. I was thinking about questions, and I was just reminded of in the Peace Corps in Niger, in West Africa. I lived in the capital city of Niamey, so tons of kids in the city, and a lot of them, got very, very rudimentary English. And every conversation I had with kids, it always went like this. They would say, "Hello, how are you?" And I would say, "Fine, thank you. How are you?" That'd pretty much be the end of the conversation. But if you notice when someone asks you how you are, have you ever wondered what would happen if you really told them how you are? And how many times when you ask someone, "How are you?" do you really want to know how they are? We have our default of "Fine, thanks," and you? But it becomes a very interesting question. I just thought it might be fun to kind of go into these two wings of mindfulness, which essentially we can break down to two questions. One of the wings is seeing clearly, or wisdom. And the other wing points toward compassion or loving awareness, how to be with what's there. So, if you like, again, you can close your eyes. Many variations of this question, but the first question here is like, how are you? What is happening right now? And if you hang out with this question, you may notice that what is happening on a number of planes or simultaneous phenomena, or seemingly simultaneous phenomena. What is happening in the world of the senses? You might notice how there is this aliveness of waves and particles of sensation coming through. What is happening in the realm of a feeling tone? Is there an internal feeling tone of pleasant or unpleasant, or that which lies in between? All this happening in the physical body. And what is happening right now in what we might call the mental body, this body of thoughts and beliefs? And what is happening right now in the what we might call the emotional body, or kind of the limbic, the quality of heart, the quality of mood, the quality of state? And what is happening in your relationship to what is happening? And exploring this question as you're aware of all these interrelated phenomena, can you let it be? What does it mean to let things be as they are? What does that feel like? And as you were possibly to bring in some sort of loving awareness, some kindness or empathy, what shifts when you explore this? If you'd like, you can deepen your breath. If you like, you can open your eyes. When someone asks me, like, how are you? It really does become this question, like, what exactly am I supposed to report out here? Am I reporting out the whole realm of physical sensations? Am I reporting out the feeling tone? Am I reporting out my thoughts, my beliefs, my emotions, my moods, my states? There's a lot going on when someone says, how are you? But the question remains that there are these questions that can help you pay attention. For example, in the meditation we explored earlier, when you're focusing on the breath, when you ask yourself, what happens when I count my breaths from 1 to 5? What happens when I scan for new sensations here at my anchor? What happens when I explore whether this next inhalation is longer or shorter than the inhalation preceding? Those questions invite you into a deepening sense of intimacy, to sift more into the juicy details of aliveness. There are questions that can help you be the witness to your experience. Can you imagine the seat of the observer, taking the seat of the observer? There are questions that can help you access compassion. What happens if you bring empathy, compassion to this moment? Or how is love experiencing this moment? It's a really juicy one. And questions that can help you to access wisdom. So learning how to use these questions is so juicy. So, how have questions supported the evolution of consciousness? And I don't want to go too long into the detail, but I just find this stuff really, really interesting. When we talk about inquiry, again, we sort of have like scientific inquiry, medical inquiry, philosophical inquiry, and then we have kind of like non-dual inquiry, we have problem-solving inquiry. But in terms of scientific inquiry, one of the questions here is, how do we use questions to really see into the physical nature of reality? So to quote J. Robert Oppenheimer, he said, there must be no barriers to the freedom of inquiry. There is no place for dogma in science. The scientist is free and must be free to ask any question, to doubt any assertion, to seek for any evidence, to correct any errors. I love that. because we can apply the same thing to exploring our own subjective experience to the nature of reality. There's very much a science to this practice, and why many people with scientific backgrounds are very attracted to Buddhist philosophy, because it's about the study of reality. And as the Buddha famously, allegedly said, as ascribed to him in his dying words, were, "Be a lamp unto yourself. Do not look for teachers, for scripture, for others to tell you what is true. You must verify this for yourself." This is the power of inquiry. And when the Dalai Lama said, if there is any distinction between what science says and what Buddhism says, then Buddhism needs to re-examine. So, we're looking into the nature of reality. We're using the power of an inquisitive mind to take us into more and more clear seeing. Then we have all this juicy philosophical inquiry. And again, I'm not going to belabor this too long, but I want to mention it because I find it exciting as well. I recently run across, I watched The Good Life series on television. Tara and I watched this. We found it to be a wonderful, kind of benign thing to watch when we were brain dead. It was written by a guy named Michael Schur, and he's got an amazing background. He went to Harvard. He was a writer for Late Night with Conan O'Brien. With Saturday Night Live, I believe. And then he kind of he moved out west, and he was a staff writer for The Office. And he really learned his comedy chops there. And he created Parks and Recreation and made a lot of money, and made a lot of money for the network. So the network basically said, look, you're golden, you can do anything you want. And he said, okay, I want to write a comedy on ethics and moral philosophy. And he did. And if you ever watch The Good Life, it's very much an exploration on ethics and moral philosophy in very, very clever, engaging stories. And he went on to write a book on philosophy, which is really taking a lot of what he explored in the book, but also bringing it forward. And what he said was, these philosophers were some of the highest IQ people out there, over these last millennia. And it can be really helpful to look at what they were thinking about. Now, I've taken some philosophy courses, and I find my brain kind of gets overwhelmed. I'm much more of a mystic, but when you're really looking at scientific philosophical inquiry, I ran across this quote from Wittgenstein, who said, I love this, he said, so in the end, when one is doing philosophy, one gets to the point where one would like to emit an inarticulate sound. I can imagine how many times he just went like, ugh. But nonetheless, philosophy is using powerful questions. Some classical philosophical inquiries. What is the meaning of life? Do we know what language is? Can mystical experiences justify belief? How does the brain produce the mind? These questions, when examined rigorously, they move consciousness forward. They take the mind into uncomfortable places where it has to synthesize in order to see more clearly into what is real. So an example of kind of the pragmatic aspect of this. In the second half of the 5th century BC, sophists were teachers who specialized in using tools of philosophy and rhetoric to persuade people to their point of view. So it was kind of the classical way that they would engage into this. And at that time, Socrates began to engage into these discussions, and he developed another way of exploring reality. And as the classic thing goes, in Greece, a man goes to the oracle and asks the wise oracle, who is the wisest man in Greece? And the oracle says, Socrates. So when this was posed to Socrates, he said, well, wouldn't you have to be wiser than me to recognize me as the wisest man in Greece? And thus began the Socratic method, the power of questions. And the Socratic method is still very much applied, particularly in like medical and legal education. It's a way to really drill into understanding difficult concepts and difficult principles, and to help students think critically. If you think of like in law school, when some student is put on the hot seat, the professor will pepper them with questions and challenging them, looking for flaws in their logic. They're drawing on the somatic method. And basically, it's exploring beliefs and using a series of questions to test the logic. And so, in essence, how it works is you would name a preconception and kind of then clarify what that preconception is, and then you test your hypothesis by asking questions, and then you decide, do I accept this or not? So here are some of the questions that come up, and again, this is around helping to kind of clarify thinking. When someone is speaking, when you ask, well, could you clarify that? Could you explain that a little further? When you're challenging assumptions, well, why do you think that's true? Or what if it's not true? Or providing evidence. Is there a reason that I should doubt this? Or discovering alternative viewpoints and perspectives. Is it possible to see this from another point of view? Or exploring implications. Well, if this happened, what else would happen? How would that affect this? And then questioning the question. Why is this question important? Why should we be talking about this? These are just some of the ways that we can use questions to kind of clarify what it is we're even talking about. They can sharpen your intellect. And you can sense how this works with scientific inquiry, to really explore, is this really true? What if it's not true? Is there any other way of approaching this? Is this really the right question we should be looking at? These are all ways that we take this mind and we bring it to explore some particular phenomena. That was a very, very quick overview and a very, very quick dipping our toes into Socratic inquiry. And I am very, very clear up front that I am not knowledgeable in a lot of philosophy. I've read philosophy and I've studied it, but I wouldn't in no way claim myself as an expert, and I'm not a science guy. The truth is, most of my influence and inquiry has been from kind of Eastern inquiry. And I'd like to just talk about that as kind of a context just for a few moments. I think one of the most potent examples of inquiry from the Eastern perspective is articulated beautifully by a teacher by the name of Ramana Maharshi, who really brought forth what could be called self-inquiry meditation. And a really cool story of Ramana Maharshi, again, this is brief. But when he was 17 years old, he had a beloved uncle who died suddenly. He was so shocked and so bereft from his uncle just there and then not there, that he was really quite turned upside down around this. And as the story goes, or as I understand the story, when he was in like the equivalent of like high school, he went back to his house and lay down on his sleeping mat to really ask himself, what happened to my uncle? What happens when we die? And as he lay down in this very, very deep question of what happens when the body falls away, he had a profound, transcendent experience of what we might call source. And that experience transformed his life. His entire life then became more and more dedicated toward really understanding the sense of the I, or the self. He spent many, many years in silence, just kind of in silent communion. Many people came to explore, to be with him, to be in his presence. And he spoke of how questions, two questions in particular, could not only point your attention back toward true nature or the self, but they could also actively strip away what you are not. The first question he offered was to ask yourself with deep sincerity, who am I? And to stay with that question like an anchor. The second question is, what do I really, really want? And these two questions, when you sit with them and you keep bringing yourself back to them, it's not as if they point toward an intellectual answer. They take you into a deep, subjective, transformational experience. It takes a lot of firepower to hang out with these questions. And for a number of times, I subjected myself to one of the most brutal programs I've ever taken, known as it goes by different names. Enlightenment Intensive is one, where you sit in dyads across from another person. And in this practice, and I'll go into detail around this form of practice, but with great sincerity, you open yourself to whatever might arise, and your partner will ask you, please tell me who you are. And your practice is to go internally and to begin to name the place, the experience this question takes you. And what I found is I needed that rigor to stay with it because, as I've shared before, number one, I got really bored with myself. But the boredom I had with my own story was nothing in comparison with the boredom I was experiencing listening to other people. Just this stripping away of story. Really, really powerful. And over time, it really did make this ineffable sense of source or self, absolute self, a little more available. So along these lines, I'd like to offer a little Zen pop quiz meditation. I'm aware our time is flying. And if you like, you can, with your eyes closed, take 3 slow breaths. And as I ask you these questions, if the questions resonate for you, that's great. If they don't, no big deal. We're just going to take a little bit of time here. And you might just take a moment, come in contact with, say, your breath. Notice where you feel the breath the most predominant. And now, do you have a sense of the observer? Of who or what it is that is aware of your breathing right now? Is it possible to locate that sense of the observer on the inside? Many people find there's some kind of locale in the head, some in the heart or belly. But sense now if you can just locate where you sense the observer. And as you sense the location of the observer, you might ask yourself the following question. What is it that is aware of this location? And Could you soften that place and simply notice what happens? What is it that is aware of this? And again, you might inquire, is there a sense now of a location of an observer that you can discern? And you might ask, what is it that is aware of this? And sense if you can soften that location. And then very gently you can begin to deepen your breath. And you might open your eyes. And just sense what may have shifted for you in the last few moments of this practice. I feel like I had to call you back before you floated away. But this is a fascinating practice. And one I find really powerful, and it points toward this sense of what we might call non-local awareness or non-dual awareness. And I find myself quite surprised sometimes when I'm aware of something. I ask myself, well, can I locate that sense of awareness? And sometimes it's like around the eyes or my brain. And then to notice that location and ask, well, what is it that's aware of this? And soften that location. And quite often, not all the time, there can be a sense of expansion. Sometimes people report this kind of like, they can feel almost like a dome, and there's something that's aware of this. It's a pointer, sometimes. The sense of non-local awareness, and it points towards something that's really at the root of self-inquiry. And the roots of it really go back to the Upanishads. The 6th to 5th centuries BC. It's really the oldest scripture in Hinduism, and referred to in Vedanta. It's the investigation of Atman, the investigation of the self. It's about directing the inquirer back toward the nature of the true self. And in Hindu Vedantic philosophy is really based on the concept that the higher self or the true self is absolutely identical to Brahman, or absolute reality. That is to say, who you really are is reality. Or you might even say, who you truly are is God itself. So Advaita Vedanta, which is this incredibly rich tradition. Think how long this has been part of our consciousness. How long this has been embraced and nuanced and nurtured, is about this practice of directing the mind back toward awareness itself. It's so juicy. So back to questions. So here we have the application of questions in science, in philosophy, in medicine, and here we have the application of questions that point toward liberation to the ultimate realization. How do we apply this? And so some of the ways we're going to explore in the future are going to be some very practical applications. For example, in writing this talk, I always write down or reflect on, why is this interesting? Why is this important? And when I realize that questions drive consciousness, they drive awareness, that we're ruled by unconscious questions, and when we learn to ask different questions, we can direct our attention in powerful ways. And there's an art to this. When I reflect on why this is important to me, it gets me pretty hyped up. It gets me pretty excited. Another question I ask myself is, how do I want to feel at the end of offering this talk? And how I wanted to feel at the beginning was that I did a good job. that I was able to communicate my enthusiasm and my interest. Whether or not I did a good job or not, who knows? But I hope my enthusiasm came across here. And how I wanted you to feel at the end was that you might sense the possibility of questions in your life. And that you might also have some practical tools that can shift your awareness in really powerful ways. Questions can help you in solutions, and we'll explore in future talks some of the incredible applications for making decisions in your life, deciding what's most important, exploring how to heal a broken relationship. Questions will help you move toward the answers that really resonate for you. And then there are the questions of liberation, the questions that take you toward cutting through and seeing more and more clearly. There's an art to asking questions, and we'll dive deep into that, exploring using questions as contemplation, but then questions as somatic contemplation, which is really, really powerful. It is not just a mental process. It is a deeply embodied practice of inquiry, and there's some beautiful, beautiful elements that can really enrich your practice dramatically. So I hope you found this helpful. And a final question for you. What would you like to remember from this last 40 minutes? Are there any particular questions that interest you? Anything you would want to know more about? What might those questions be? There's a beautiful quote I ran across as I've been thinking about this topic for a while. From Constance Friday, whoever that is. Great quote. Curiosity didn't kill the cat. It transformed the cat into a lion. Let's take just a few minutes for a short little centering. If you like, you can close your eyes. Where do you feel the breath the most predominant on the inside right now? Is there anything right now in the body and the mind that could soften or relax or let go? And you might reflect on the following question as our time here comes to a close. As you reflect on all the possibilities of what you might do when this talk closes in a minute or two, what would be an act of kindness? An act of generosity toward yourself that would feel nourishing and nurturing? And if you did that, not perfectly, but if you incline the mind toward self-generosity and self-care, what would that feel like? What would that be like inside? As you're ready, you might deepen your breath and let yourself begin to move and stretch in any way that feels good for you. Thank you so much for your time and for your attention. I hope you find this stuff helpful. I look forward to sharing more about all the nuances of these practices and the ways that they can really, really make a difference in your life. So may you and your deepest questions have a wonderful time together, and I look forward to being with you soon. Happy trails.